Hello and welcome to this lecture about assessment, and it's more about accountability measures as well, and this will build on your already developing knowledge of assessment. So let's have a look at some things. Now, one of the things that we've spoken about and I think is incredibly important is to see that assessment is not a bolt-on and bolt-off thing. It's not something that we plan for. Well, it is something that we plan for, but it's not something that we plan our lessons and then add in assessment. It should be an integral part of who we are and what we're doing within the classroom. And so this from Paul Black suggests that many writers about assessment and many teachers regard assessment as a peripheral component of pedagogy, one that's inescapable, but which always threatens to undermine the most valued aim, that of developing the learning capacity of students. The phrase assessment for learning challenges this view, and some handle this challenge by regarding it as quite separate from summative assessment. This I regard as a fundamental error, one that arises from the lack of a broad and more complex view of the role of assessment in pedagogy. Assessment does affect our pedagogy. It affects everything that we do within it. It might be that we need to make adjustments to our pedagogy and the way that we approach teaching and learning. Sometimes those can be positive, sometimes those can be negative accommodations for it. And today we're going to look at some various aspects of that. So the first thing to consider is the importance of it. It's not, it has an impact on how students learn and everything else. So there's a couple of quotes here. The first from Pollard: assessment has a profound influence on learning. It doesn't just measure or find out what a student will learn. It also affects what is learned, how pupils view themselves as learners, their attitude to school, and possibly their whole future. And that's really important. We have to recognize that assessment has an impact on students' views of themselves, how well they're doing. And we need to consider that if we just give a bold grade, for example, so I don't know, maybe a grade 8, or perhaps we give 9 out of 10, or any of those things, and we just give figures or numbers, then that has an emotional impact on the student. And so we need to consider how we give that feedback, and that will be as we explore assessment for learning, which isn't the focus of today, but we do need to kind of have this at the background of everything that we do. Do children feel as though they're failures because they have only got a certain mark? And so we need to do more. And I think that's really integral to what we're doing. And as we consider assessment and its purpose, we do need to consider its impact as well. And it might seem strange to kind of discuss, but we live in a neoliberal system, or a market-based system. What does that mean? Well, this builds very much on the work of Paulo Freire a little bit as well, in the sense that what he said is that what we learn and how we learn essentially can reinforce the status quo. It helps us understand what is important to the ruling class or whatever else, if we look at it from a Marxist perspective. A neoliberal is about kind of the idea that there's a competition in markets, and we can see this in schools. We can see school league tables. We can see all of those things that kind of pit schools against one another, but also suggests certain criteria against which things will be judged, and therefore we begin this marketization of education. And this hasn't always been the case. Yes, there have always been measures in place, but perhaps they've not always been in competition with one another. So we have to consider, and that's kind of the world in which we live. With this as a background, we need to ask ourselves the question, why are we assessing? And so the Teaching and Learning Research Programme summarizes them into 3 broad categories. So to help build pupils' understanding in day-to-day lessons, to provide information on pupils' achievements to those on the outside of the pupil-teacher relationships, as to parents, to other institutions, and to employers, and then also to hold individuals and institutions to account through the publication of results and so on. So maybe consider, in your experience, which one of these is the most often talked about and perhaps the most focused upon. I think they begin with the most important. So obviously the most important is to help build pupils' understanding within day-to-day lessons. Formative assessment, which we've explored in detail. Then to provide that information to others so that we can help others understand how the children are progressing. And then lastly, to hold institutions to account. So I guess the question is that, although that for me is the order of its importance, starting with the most important, is that something that is borne out in reality? And if I think about my experiences in education, there are some schools that I've worked in and observed where the third is the most important. And so when assessment data is presented, it's very much about we're not doing well enough. And it's like, well, actually, let's look at how children are doing and look at the individual students themselves and how they're making progression, how we're building that within our particular approaches. Okay, all of that is kind of as a background, because we're going to talk about school or education accountability measures. So just pause the video for a moment and think, what do I already know? What accountability measures do I know that are used within schools? You may have come across PISA, you may have come across Key Stage 2 results, CATS, Fish Family Trust, YELLIS, ALICE, ALPS, CBA, all different kinds of things, and I've gone too far. So there's all kinds of things that are there. And at various points over the last 30 years, these have been most perhaps important. Some schools, for example, I remember doing CAT tests, cognitive ability tests, when children come in year 7, because we didn't quite trust the Key Stage 2 results, which is just mad. So there's all kinds of things. The one that possibly we'll talk about most is the Programme for International Student Assessment. And this is where the marketisation of the neoliberal system is highlighted. So PISA are tests that are done around the world, generally focused on literacy, maths, and science. And it draws on content, as it suggests, that can be found in curricula across the world and looks at students' ability to apply knowledge and skills and analyse, reason and communicate effectively. So PISA tests are carried out. And they're used, I guess, as a stick with which to beat countries, or as different things in different ways. And so these headlines are not unusual. These are from 2019, but other things come up. I think there's one there from 2023. UK rises in international school rankings, Wales slumps to worst school test results. So does this mean that the UK is rubbish, good, because of the PISA rankings? And we see on the 2018 test, we can see that the UK has got better over time. But then you can also see that there are examples of countries that have stayed towards the top. So, for example, China and Singapore. So that has led to the UK and the departments for education across the developed countries and also in England, looking at what is happening elsewhere. So you may have heard of Singapore maths, for example, and what happens there is we look at what other people are doing and think, okay, we're not doing well enough. We need to do better in the way that we do things. So this is the way that governments respond. And is this the blunt measure? Is this the way that we should do it? Well, I don't know. I have my own opinions on that, but this is the way that it happens. And it's not just us, lots of countries do the same thing. It was recognised that this is a fairly blunt measure. And so it was added life satisfaction and growth mindset. how do students in the United Kingdom feel about their lives? So it's not just now about English, maths and science. How do they feel about their lives? And yeah, there's issues with those types of things. But again, it tries to do it. And 66% of young people said they were sometimes or always worried, compared with an OECD average of 50%. So have we done anything about that? Is that something? So again, assessment isn't just about stats and figures, but then stats and figures give us an indication. But then how does even PISA affect the education system? Well, as I've mentioned, the Department for Education looks at these PISA results and thinks, okay, how are we doing? Can we do any better? And it is about those results that kind of drive some of the education policy, because it is a measure. And you can see this reflected in schools as well, where schools look at results, whatever those results might be, and then make changes based on those. And we're going to discuss that at some future point today. So we need to look at this. Then we have school accountability. And so there are these school accountability measures. We have Progress 8. We have the percentage of pupils entering the English Baccalaureate. We'll come back to that. The percentage of students staying in education or employment after Key Stage 4. The percentage of people achieving a grade 5 or above in English and maths. Attainment 8. EBAC, average point score. And again, we'll come back to that because EBAC is a contentious issue, perhaps maybe disappearing as well, but we will discuss that in a few minutes. And these were brought in, I think about 2016, somewhere around there, and they replaced 5 A-star to Cs at GCSE. That was including English and maths, which was a school accountability measure. So that kind of governed, because this was seen to be fairer. And we'll look at that and kind of took into account what's known as value added. And again, I'll come back to that. The 5 A-star to Cs, including English and maths, replaced what was the previous measure, which was 5 A-star to Cs. There were some schools that gamed that system and basically entered children for GNVQs, which were worth 2 GCSE grades. And so therefore there were some schools that topped the league tables because they were entering children for GNVQs and then perhaps one other subject. And so it kind of skewed the statistics. And so that's why it led the government to say, well, it has to include English and maths, and there needs to be a focus on that. Is that linked to PISA, or is that linked to the idea that, well, English and maths are central and really needful to function in society? And I think it's more the second, that they're needed to function in society, but it's also doesn't harm that it's part of PISA assessment as well. Now, what's interesting is, let's have a discussion, I guess, about, well, is it all bad? Is it problematic that schools are held to account? Well, this guidance here suggests, well, there's systematic, significant and robust evidence that abolishing school league tables markedly reduced school effectiveness in Wales. The impact is sizable, a fall of 1.92 GCSE grades per student per year, equivalent to 0.23 of a school level standard deviation. The key published performance measure, the percentage of students achieving at least 5 good GCSE passes, falls by 3.4 percentage points per school. So this is the example that, well, actually, if we don't measure, if we don't hold schools to account, then is there any motivation to improve? And the suggestion is, well, in Wales, schools didn't perform as well without that measure. So we need to kind of think, okay, although I'm not the biggest fan of the neoliberal marketization of education, and also the idea that the school league tables, actually, one of the pros, I guess, of it is that it does drive innovation, it does drive performance. So yeah, it's maybe the best of a bad lot, really, is that yes, we might not agree with it, but actually it does have some good impact. And so we need to consider that. And GCSEs are important. Some people might consider it an anachronism, but they do act as gatekeepers. And we might think, for example, that the education system and the GCSEs and the way that children are assessed based on exams and everything else are perhaps outdated and don't help children show the best of their ability. Well, it was kind of shown during COVID that if we, when we used teacher assessment, that didn't work either, for one reason or another. And so it's kind of the best of a bad lot at the moment. Yes, they might not be perfect, but I guess they show children's learning. But do they show all children's learning, I guess is the question. So thinking about the school accountability measure, we look at Progress 8. And so we see that Progress 8 is a secondary accountability measure aimed at measuring the progress of pupils across a selected set of 8 subjects. It's a type of value-added measure. So the children come in with a certain level, and what progress do they make? And it's also used across an attainment 8. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So you may see that already the idea in the imposition of Progress 8 as a school accountability measure did have a significant impact on the curriculum that schools offered. So in the old days, pre-2016 or so, where the school accountability measure was 5 A-star to Cs, it wasn't unusual, and I remember this, of children doing 10 GCSEs. And so therefore doing those 10 GCSEs meant that there was a higher likelihood, I guess is what was said, for a child to achieve 5 A-star to Cs because they had that breadth. Now with 8 subjects and there being a Progress 8, very much so, most children will only do 8 GCSEs. Is that bad? Probably not, no. It allows them to focus and perhaps make better progress in those particular areas. I guess the question then arises is, are they getting a broad curriculum in there? And so, again, that's something that we will explore. So how do we find the Progress 8 score? Well, as I mentioned, it's based on children's performance across 8 subjects, and it's known as the Attainment 8. So we need to explore what Attainment 8 looks like at this point and what that is. So it's a measure of a pupil's average grade across a set suite of 8 subjects. They're measured on a 9 to 1 scale. Now, I guess I'll show you this slide. This was first introduced, and actually this is the second iteration, because when the consultation happened in around 2014, 2016, the initial view was that a grade 5 would be the benchmark, which means that a grade 5 would be equivalent to, not equivalent to a C, but would be the measure against which things were covered. So a pass would be, a good pass or a strong pass would be known as a grade 5. I think realizing that this disadvantaged some, it was then changed to a 4, and a 4 was equivalent to an old C. And so we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so we have a greater spread within that. And the idea was, and we will come back to that, that broadly the same number who achieved a grade C would get a grade 4, and those who would achieve grade 7 would still get a grade A would still get a grade 7. Now, you may think, I guess, and there is a video in the accompanying PowerPoint that kind of talks about this. You may think that grade boundaries are set and that if pupils do better, then they'll, however, grade boundaries change each year. Why do they change each year? Because the government, Ofqual, say that the percentage of children getting a grade 4 or getting a grade 7 should only deviate by about, at the most, 0.1%. And so it's not according to the same grade boundaries year on year. It's about, well, actually, only, and I'm making these numbers up, only 50% of students are able to get a grade 4. So if last year, when you look at the performance of students, and 50% of students in their exam got, I don't know, 50 out of 100, then that would be the grade boundary. If this year 50% got, I don't know, 48, then the grade boundary would go down 2. And so teachers spend a lot of time, and it really is important to try to raise exam performance. But sometimes some of the things are outside of their control, because a 50 last year might have got you a grade 4, but this year it won't because the grade boundary is now 52, and so on and so on and so on. So we have to know that this is how the grade boundaries are decided. And this is seen by government and by awarding organisations to be the fairest. And part of the argument is, well, teachers year on year get better at teaching the specification, better at preparing children for exams, and so therefore they are going to naturally do better, even though they are of the same ability. And so Key Stage 2 data helps set those boundaries, helps set expectations, and so exam boards know, or awarding organisations know, how cohorts should perform. Now, again, we see headlines every exam results for, and it says exams are getting harder, or the grade boundaries, or less children are getting A stars or grade 9s in this sense. And this goes for A level as well. And it's like, well, that's because there's a system in place to ensure that the boundaries kind of reflect the cohort and everything else. So we just need to know that, really. There's nothing we can do about it, but it's just something to be aware of and to keep an eye on, so that when you're analysing exam performance, you can look at the raw marks as well as the grades that are actually given. And we have to be conscious of those things. Okay, so let's look at the Attainment 8. So currently, it takes the average of pupils' points across a set suite of their best 8 subjects. The 8 qualifications must fall into one of 3 buckets. So if it doesn't fall into one of the buckets, it's not counted. And that has important implications for perhaps the availability of certain subjects. So currently, the Attainment 8 buckets are these. The first 2, which are double weighted, are English and maths. Okay, because they're double weighted, and again, I'll explain what this means in future slides, English and maths are given a priority. And quite rightly, because they are important subjects, it does mean, for example, that you will see that catch-up classes or perhaps English and maths are given priority in terms of timetabling, in terms of number of lessons. Also, perhaps if a child needs withdrawing from another subject to do some catch-up English and maths, then it's more important that they do English and maths according to the Attainment 8 bucket, because they're worth double weighted. In the second bucket, you can have 3 subjects, but they are what's known as EBAC, or English Baccalaureate qualifications. So those are sciences, computer sciences, geography, history, or languages. And then the other bucket, which is any of the other EBacc subjects or anything else, essentially. Now, you can't replace. So if there is no, so let's say a student does English, maths, and they do combined science, but then they do RE. And then for the other 3 subjects, they do art and design, drama, and I don't know, another PE, for example. What you can see is you actually only have 2 EBacc subjects. And so therefore, the student can only achieve in 7 subjects. And so their average attainment 8 score will go down because they will get 0 for one of those subjects, because for the 8th subject, because it doesn't exist. And that has a huge impact on options and things. So when this was first introduced, it was not unusual for the options to have different things. So you would have to choose double award science, for example. You could choose a 3rd science, but then a lot of schools would say you have to choose the humanities and you have to choose a language. And then because you've done all of those, you would perhaps have, so English, maths, dual award science, languages, and a humanities, you would then only have 2 subjects left to choose. And so the choice was going down. And I remember attending an options evening and not attainment 8 being explained, but essentially listening to the head teacher or the deputy head justify why there was so little choice in discussing about, well, this will give your son, because it was my son at the time, a broad approach to education and a broad suite of subjects. And it's like, well, that might be true, but at the same time, I know exactly why you're having them do X, Y, or Z, because if they don't do X, Y, or Z, then their attainment 8 score won't be good. So it did have an impact on the curriculum. One of the examples, and I'll use this just because I teach RE, was that RE wasn't in the EBacc, even though it's a humanities, but it's not according to the EBacc. And so therefore the number of entries for RE dropped significantly because it wasn't one of those subjects. And that may have had an impact, well, it did have an impact on other subjects. If, and this is an example, English, so only, so English is only double weighted if a pupil has taken both English language and English lit, and in this case, the higher of the 2 grades is used and double weighted. And the lower graded English subject can still go into the 3rd bucket as well. So it kind of counts for both. And then maths, yes, we know that. And again, I've kind of talked about these things already. So yes, all of those things are found. The 8 grades from the 3 buckets are added together and divided by 10 to produce a student's attainment 8 score. The maths grade is given double weighting, as is English. No matter how full or empty the 3 buckets are, a student's score is always divided by 10. So even if they'd only done, I don't know, 7 of the 8 subjects, it would still be divided by 10. So let's look at this example. So this student did art, got a grade 6. It was included in the measure because it was bucket 3. Music, yes, it was bucket 3, and English language, and again, it was bucket 3 because bucket 1 had already been filled. So those were kind of those things. So let's look at her attainment 8 score. Talks about the double weighting. So if you add all of those grades together, 8, 14, 6, so she got a 4 in maths and 7 in English lit. If you add all of those things together, 54, it's then divided by 10, So her attainment 8 score is 5.4, okay, across the board. Okay, so that is her attainment 8 score. Now, children are not given their attainment 8 score. It only becomes important when what happens is it's used in the school accountability measure. So if we take an example here of Sonia, this kind of does the same type of things. She gets 2.9 because some of the things that she does, music, art, and business and enterprise, don't count because she has no EBAC subjects. She has no sciences. She has no computer science. ICT is not, and things. So her best grades are taken, but basically she does 5 subjects and therefore gets a grade of 2.9. Okay, so how does that work? Well, the Progress 8 score for a pupil is calculated by taking their actual attainment 8 score, so what they get, so the 5.4 or the 2.9, and they take away minus their estimated attainment 8 score. So when a pupil comes into your school, secondary school, they will have a predicted attainment 8 score based on their Key Stage 2 data. And so therefore, it's set. And so you will know the GCSE predicted grades. And those are important because if students perform less or not as well as their predicted grade, then the attainment 8 score or the progress 8 score can actually go into negatives. Yeah, I've mentioned that already. So skip through all of those. So if our student Andrea from the earlier slides had received a Key Stage 2 average of 4.7, she would be expected to achieve an attainment 8 grade of 49 or 4.9. This is based on the national average attainment 8 score of other pupils who achieved the same Key Stage 2 result as Andrea. As we saw, Andrea's actual attainment 8 score was 5.4. So her progress 8 score is plus 0.5. This means that she achieved an average of half a grade better per subject than other pupils with the same prior attainment at Key Stage 2. So she has a positive progress 8 score. That's great. And then Sonia, well, her Key Stage 2, she had a predicted of 4.9. She actually got 2.9. And so her progress 8 score is -2. Again, not significant on an individual level because that is never reported to students. But the school's progress 8 score is the mean average of its pupils' progress 8. This is therefore calculated by adding each individual pupil's progress 8 score and then dividing this by the total number of pupils. So in this example, let's say there's 200 pupils in the school for taking GCSEs. The school's progress 8 score is 29.5 because what they've done is they've added all of those numbers together from 1 to 100. Some of them have done better, some of them have done worse, but overall they've got a plus 29.5. And then they divide that by 200. So their progress 8 score is 0.147 or 0.15. So that's positive because they have achieved better than expected. Now, whether a school feels that 0.145 is adequate, that's for schools, but then it's published in league tables. Yeah, and some schools will have performed better. Now, if a school does below 0, then obviously that will cause alarm bells and everything else. It used to, at certain grades, trigger offset inspections and different things, but it affects league tables. And so therefore, it is in a school's best interest to get as good a progress 8 score as possible. Thinking, and I don't know that this happens, But if you've got a student who is, I don't know, not doing very well in a couple of subjects, it might be that the school decides that they might withdraw them from those subjects because they're going to do significantly worse, and they will kind of, if you like, just cope with a 0 score as opposed to a minus score. So it depends on the school and how they approach Progress 8 as to the implications of those things. But this is the school accountability measure. And I guess we need to think, is this fair? Well, the idea is that yes, it is, because it looks at value added. It looks at what a student is expected to do versus how they actually perform. So it's not, so for example, if you have a student who is estimated all 2s, if we use the 5 A* to C, including English and maths, as kind of a measure, then they are never going to be able to do that, and so that would be a negative way of measuring their progress. But actually, in this case, if they're estimated all 2s and get 3s, then they actually have a really positive, they have like a +1 attainment 8 score. So that's good. And so it kind of takes away kind of an imbalance. Some people would say, well, actually, no, it doesn't. Because if you consider the higher ability students, perhaps they're estimated all 9s, well, they can't do better than what they're predicted. So their maximum Progress 8 score is 0. They can't do any better than that. So there's all kinds of, I guess, messiness with it. But we just need to know that that's the Progress 8 score. And it might be worth you considering looking at the GCSE curriculum or the Key Stage 4 curriculum that is offered. Has it been influenced in your school? And has it been influenced by this Progress 8 accountability measure? It might have been, it might not have been, but I would imagine it would. And so have a look at that and see, okay, how does this work? And again, they're used to construct school league tables. Now, we know, well, maybe you don't know, but GCSEs were changed from also in terms of, as well as in terms of the numbers rather than the letter grades, but they, in England anyway, but they also changed in terms of what was required. And this again feeds into the marketisation of the neoliberal system, because Michael Gove, who was then Secretary of State, suggested that we needed to change and reform GCSEs because we needed to raise educational standard to match those elsewhere. And so there's an urgent need to reform. He also wanted at that point to make the top grades rarer and so more meaningful. So that's why there's a bigger spread. So you can now see a 9. There's less who get a 9 than get an A* because the A* is broken down into 8s and 9s. Making the courses harder and then providing a better grounding for further study. Now, sometimes we think that the curriculum is a neutral thing, but actually we look at some of the ways that things changed and it did reinforce a particular view of education. So we moved away in the GCSE changes and A-level changes from a modular approach where children or students could take end of unit exams or end of year exams at the end of year 10 and year 12 that counted towards the final mark, to them all doing exams at the end of year 11 and year 13. This goes back to the way it was when I was in education, and I think it goes back to the way that it was when Michael Gove was in education as well. And I think that kind of reinforces, Dylan William once said that we learn most about teaching and how to teach in our first 16 years or first 18 years of life. because how we are taught kind of influences the way we think teaching happens. And so I wonder if Michael Gove kind of fell into that trap. Because I look at the exam burden, for example, on students at the end of year 11 and the end of year 13, and it's incredible. And just because I had to go through it doesn't mean that I would want everybody else to go through it. We also see, for example, the nature of what is being studied. So perhaps you look at the texts that are studied in English literature, and there has been a greater move towards British authors. You look at, and not all of those are bad, because, for example, in RA, or religious studies, you have 2 religions have to be studied at GCSE rather than the one previously. So actually it broadened the curriculum. But it also, in many cases, added content and did all kinds of things. So again, we're going through the process at this point, and I'll come back to this. There has been a curriculum review where a GCSE specification is supposed to last for about 5 or 6 years. We're now nearly 10 years in. And so it's going to have to go through the process of reform again. So those things need to consider why and what to include in those reforms. Now, one of the ideas behind the GCSE reforms was to improve achievement or attainment across the board. So not just for the higher attaining, but also for the lower attaining. Now, the Sutton Trust, who explore GCSE grades and kind of performance for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, while there has been a slight increase in those achieving grades 9 to 4 for both disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged pupils, there's little perceptible difference at the top end. So under the previous system, 2% of disadvantaged pupils achieved the top grades of A star, whereas now 1% now achieve a 9. So the increase in disadvantaged attainment gap has not materialized, but there are increases in certain subjects. So it's interesting to see whether it has had the impact that it desired, because I'm not convinced it has. If you look at these, you look at the grades that have been awarded, and there's not been, if you look, there's not a significant difference in the pink, in the higher grades. There's not been. But in the D to G grades, yes, they've shrunk a little bit. So maybe the middle has improved a little bit as well. So there have been perhaps some small steps. As I mentioned before, at the end of 2025, there was a curriculum and assessment review report published. Now, this is for the future. This has not happened yet, but its recommendations, which are likely to happen, remove the EBAC performance measures, because there, as well as the Progress 8 and Attainment 8 scores, there was also a student's EBAC score. And although that's never been used by individuals, it has been used in school accountability measures. So chances are EBAC is going to be taken away. And retain Progress 8 and Attainment 8, but rename the current EBAC bucket to Academic Breadth bucket. Now, nowhere in the report does it suggest what that means. Does that mean while the EBAC has gone away, we will still expect to see science, humanities, languages in the second bucket? I don't know. It doesn't really make clear what that means. Or is that going to be broader? And so it has to be, I don't know, one arts-based subject, one humanities-based subject, all of those things. So that's a wait and see. And then I guess value added is, how are we going to make sure that the approach to school accountability is inclusive? Now, they did notice this, and for me, this is this is obvious and has been obvious from the very moment it was suggested, but somehow consecutive or successive governments have ignored this. The review suggests that it's clear that the English Baccalaureate performance measures have to some degree unnecessarily constrained students' choices. Yeah, this has affected their engagement and achievement and limited their access to and the time available for arts and vocational subjects. We endorse the need for a broad and balanced curriculum up to 16. So we live in hope at this point, but we don't know what that's going to look like. But it absolutely has reduced. So a student who wanted to do art and design and drama probably have been unable to do that over the last years, except in exceptional schools. So it's, yeah, they've recognised finally what happens. It's in writing. So hopefully the government will respond and make this a broader curriculum. But again, it's up in the air at the moment. And the report is well worth reading because it makes specific suggestions and recommendations for each subject at Key Stage 3, 4 and 5 as well. Maybe not 5. So what next? What are the implications of Progress 8 and of GCSEs for the school curriculum, what's offered at GCSE, your subject teaching and pedagogy? Now, let me use this for example. And again, apologies for using an RE example, but it's what I know. I might be able to use a couple of others as well. So imagine a school that teaches Christianity and Judaism as their two religions at GCSE. By law, Christianity has to be taught at Key Stage 3, and 2 other world religions is usually the requirement. I know a school that does Christianity and Judaism predominantly at Key Stage 3 and Christianity and Judaism at Key Stage 4 for GCSE. Why? They see Key Stage 3 as the preparation for GCSE. So if we can get them with this base knowledge, with everything they need to know, then they're going to do better at GCSE. I have a problem with that approach. I think the Key Stage 3 curriculum should be broad, and there's skills or disciplinary knowledge that can be learned by studying, I don't know, for example, Buddhism or Sikhism or whatever else, that is transferable. So it's not just the knowledge, it's also the skills that can be applied. And if we want to give that broad experience, and so I wonder, has the curriculum become very GCSE focused at Key Stage 3? Sometimes you might see that. So I know that one of my children studied or seemed to study Christmas Carol regularly because it was on the GCSE, so they were prepared to do that. So again, there's also the question, how do we assess at Key Stage 3? Well, I think there's many, many ways to assess. None of them are earth-shattering, none of them are particularly innovative, but sometimes we default to, okay, let's give exam questions at Key Stage 3, then they're prepared for those types of things at Key Stage 4 at GCSE. Questions are only one way, and those exam questions are designed for GCSE. They're not designed for 11-year-olds. Now, absolutely teach skills. So one of the skills for RE at GCSE is analysis and evaluation. There are ways to evaluate and analyze that is not an exam question. There's ways to explain and describe that is not an exam question. So I might say, okay, maybe a GCSE exam question would be mosques are essential for living a Muslim life. And then kind of you have to evaluate it from 2 points of view. Or you might have explained features of a mosque. So at Key Stage 3 or at Key Stage 4, I can still have them, I don't know, and this is very simplistic, design a brochure for a mosque, explaining why it is important for many Muslims. And so you're still doing those skills, but just in a different way. I did a research project with schools the other year, and what we were doing is exploring how we can assess at Key Stage 3. And I was suggesting different ways to assess. And one of the schools withdrew because I was suggesting that we could assess not using exam questions. And they said, we can't, we have to measure using exam questions from 7 through 11. It's like, there are other ways available. So again, we look at all of these things. And if GCSE is the end point, and I know schools are measured and it is important, but I think sometimes we take what we know at GCSE and we apply it down to Key Stage 3. When I wrote my first book in, I think it was 2015, 2014, I suggested that the way that we taught Key Stage 3, with all of its different activities, should move up to Key Stage 4 because successful teaching or good teaching works, and students will remember and students will be able to do well. And absolutely, that is my experience, because how I teach Key Stage 3 is how I've always taught Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. But what's happened since that point is actually the way that Key Stage 4 and 5 have been taught has come down to Key Stage 3. And so it's become much more, I'm going to say, structured, much more exam focused, all of those types of things. So it has that impact. So it will be useful for you to consider. In your first assignment, you spoke very much about the approach to teaching and learning, and you have an approach to teaching and learning. Do we have to amend that based on GCSE? Maybe slightly, but maybe we have to do more. And so we have to consider the importance of school accountability measures and all of those things. So everything's well worth exploring and looking at. So please take this forward and do with it as you will, and reflect on the implications of such for your teaching and learning.